Thank you. Glen is currently principal researcher at Microsoft, as well as a visiting research scholar at Princeton. This comes after a period of time as a faculty member at the University of Chicago and an incredibly brilliant career as a student. So somebody who earned a BA in 2007 and a PhD in 2008, which I've never actually asked you about that. I always get the question like, how did you do 2 PhDs, all right, when people are introducing me, but so now I'm gonna put you in the same uncomfortable position. A year, my goodness, okay. So Glen is a pretty special creature, but he's special in particular because of his effort to reinvent a way of doing economic theory that is also simultaneously normative political philosophy. So he really is hearkening back to the older tradition of a Smith or a Keynes or a Herbert George, to invoke one of his favorite figures, asking us to ask together the hardest questions about our collective lives and how to achieve justice in them. We met because he wrote an incredibly provocative article with his co-author, Eric Posner, for the New Republic some years ago about immigration. And I was so incensed by this article that I invited him to the Institute, to our seminar series. That's what I do when I'm angry at you. It's like, invite you to a seminar. So just know that next time you get invited to a seminar. But we had a really terrific time talking about the challenging ideas in his essay about how exactly one reconciles the pursuit of justice, and in that context, egalitarian distribution of material resources, with the problem of the structure of nation states, identity, how immigration interacts with political decision-making and social cohesion internally. And so we basically, I think that was the beginning of a certain kind of intellectual friendship. We think we disagree sometimes. Actually, Glen always tells me I agree with him and I just don't know it. So anyway, I'm still working that out, trying to figure that out. But the point is simply that he's written a really important book. It can be hard to assimilate. He's going to talk us through pieces of it today. It is an exercise in ideal theory. That is also sometimes hard to register when you jump into something that reads, in the first instance, like what one thinks economic policy sounds like. But at any rate, it really is an exercise in ideal theory. And so I invite you all to engage with it in that spirit, and to consider the question of what else flows from or changes if we take on board the kinds of mechanisms for decision-making and for market arrangements that Glen is advocating. With that, over to you.
Thanks so much, Danielle. Is this thing on? No? Oh. Okay. I've so enjoyed my interactions with Danielle for many years now. I think we agree on more than might meet the eye, but the one thing we maybe disagree about is whether this is an exercise in ideal theory. I'm going to start with a little bit of an exercise in ideal theory, but I would argue instead and invite you to approach it as an exercise in imagination and moral imagination. I don't believe that there is an ideal that we can know or see right now for many of the reasons that Danielle and I were just talking about. It's beyond our power of imagination, but the more we stretch that power of imagination and the more we learn as a society, the more we can hopefully imagine ambitious, better futures, and this is an attempt to do that. So I want to start with almost a pure exercise of imagination, a pure exercise of trying to push us away from our assumptions. And then I'll turn to a bit more detailed, prescriptive policy analysis after that. But in that spirit, I would ask you for the moment to suspend practical considerations and to come with me on a journey of imagination to a fictive city that I'm going to call Marketopia. So Marketopia is a bit like Zootopia, except that rather than the defining principle being the adorable and diverse mammals that populate it, the defining principle of Marketopia is that all the major private property, the buildings and the airplanes, the factories and the land, is continually up for auction to the highest bidder, who is allowed to possess that land or apartment or whatever, as long as she satisfies 2 conditions. She pays the amount that she bid as a monthly rental payment, to a central pool, and she stands ready to surrender that asset to anyone who comes along and outbids her for control of the asset. And while this principle is not applied to pets or heirlooms and so forth, it is applied to things we would usually think of as collective decisions, like who will govern Marketopia, will it exit the market union, where will the parks be located, etc. Except on these questions, we use a slightly different principle. Rather than selling it to the single highest bidder, instead, every citizen can submit bids on all of the alternatives that we could potentially choose for these things, like whether or not to exit. And whatever receives the highest total bid will be the option selected. And all the funds that are raised in this process are continually returned to the citizens of Marketopia in equal shares as what some have called a universal basic income, what I prefer to call a social dividend. Much as in Norway or in Alaska, when they sell off oil, the money is viewed as common property and is used to fund public goods in the case of Norway, or to give a dividend to citizens in the case of Alaska. So when you consider Marketopia, your first reaction is probably that this is the most extreme version of a free market, something that even Adam Smith couldn't have come up with in a fever dream. Because, you know, we think we live in a free market. We talk about living in a free market. And yet, as soon as you reflect upon it, you realize there isn't a going competitive market price on most assets that we actually encounter in our world. If you wanted to take this building and transform it into an accelerator for innovative startups in this area, you'd have to engage in a very long and drawn-out process of negotiations with Harvard University, which would probably try to charge you something that's far above what they'd be willing to accept to part with this building. And if the negotiations didn't break down, even though there was a beneficial trade to be had there, almost certainly you'd pay far in excess of a reasonable, competitive, auction-based price. So that's provocative. That maybe makes us rethink a bit whether we really live in the market society we suppose we do. But it probably doesn't sound appealing. Probably you would think to yourself, in this sort of world where everything's continually up for bid, the wealthy will dominate everything, right? They'll be able to outbid everyone else. They'll control all the resources, and they'll tyrannize over the rest of society. But then you have to ask yourself, what do you mean by the wealthy? In fact, what does it mean to be wealthy? Wealthy is an adjective form of wealth, and what is wealth, after all, but land and factories and planes and stocks and bonds and businesses and so forth. And none of those things are owned by any private individual in Marketopia. By the very rules of the system, the benefits from those assets continually flow in equal shares to every citizen. And every citizen has an equal right to contest for control of those assets using the dividends that she receives. In that sense, Marketopia is a far more thoroughgoing implementation of the idea of common ownership advocated by this 200-year-old man here than is any communist system that ever actually existed, which inevitably turned into an iron tyranny of the bureaucrats put in charge of administering those assets that was often much more severe than the capitalist oppressors that they claimed to replace with common ownership. So that sounds like a paradox. How can it be that the most extreme form of socialism is also the most extreme form of markets? That seems to contradict everything that those of us, I assume everyone in this room, who grew up during the Cold War or post-Cold War periods, thinks about politics. And yet, the notion that common ownership was necessary for a truly free and competitive market was not just a possibility in the late 19th century. It was a dogma of the political economists like Léon Walras and William Stanley Jevons, who founded the marginal revolution that led to the economics that any of you who've studied economics have studied. And it was an idea most closely associated with this person here, whose name Danielle actually slightly misstated. Does anyone know who this person is? Yeah, Henry George, right, exactly. I think you might have mixed him up with Herbert Simon, who's another person I very much admire. But usually when I'm not undermined by my introducer, I put this person up on the screen, and maybe one person in the room who hasn't read the book knows who it is. How many people knew who this was when I put the picture of him up? Most. How many knew who this guy was? Everyone. How many people, frankly, knew who this guy was when I put him up on the board? Maybe 2 or 3, right? So this guy outsold the other two combined by a factor of 3. He was the best-selling author in the English language other than the Bible for about 30 years. He had roughly the same relationship to the revolution in China that Marx had to the Russian Revolution. I could go on and on about the influence that he had, but he was an enormously important figure. But his vision of the truest free markets also being the truest form of socialism was so inconsistent with the politics of the Cold War that his ideas were largely lost to the public, but they were not lost entirely. They continued to be developed by many people, but especially by someone named William Vickrey, who won the Nobel Prize for creating a field that's known as mechanism design. And for the ethicists here, a little-known fact about Vickrey is that he was also the first to discuss the veil of ignorance in the tradition that ended up leading Rawls to adopt that concept. But Vickrey developed George's ideas into this field of mechanism design, but he viewed it as a means of social transformation. That was his vision of what mechanism design was about. And in fact, when he won the Nobel Prize, he was quite a bit of a nebbish, so he never really promoted that stuff much with the public. But when he won the Nobel Prize, he said, I now have the bully pulpit I need to bring this vision of how we can have a more just society to the public. Unfortunately, he died 2 days later. And maybe partly as a result, his ideas have mostly been used to price advertising to maximize the profits of Facebook and Google. But I don't think that we should leave to them profiting from these insights. In fact, I think our society is in dire jeopardy because we haven't learned from these ideas. And the goal of this book is to try to revive them. Why do we think our society is in dire jeopardy? Why do we think we need a new vision of social transformation? Well, I'm going to run through the traditional litany of problems that we're facing right now. Probably the most striking is the dramatic increase in inequality within wealthy countries. On the left here is the classic graph from Piketty and Saez showing that the share of income accruing to the top 1% and top 0.1% of the income distribution in the United States has roughly doubled from the 1970s until today. And at the same time, on the right here, we see that the share of income accruing to all work, all labor, as opposed to capital, has fallen by about 10 percentage points over that same period. Now, if that were, as, say, you might describe neoliberal rhetoric, sort of things that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan argued, if that were all just a price that we have to pay for a more dynamic, competitive, innovative society, that might be a price we'd be willing to accept. But at precisely the same time that we've seen this dramatic increase in inequality, I purport to say that actually taxes have increased in the economy. Now that sounds like a paradox. You think taxes have been going down. But the thing is, governments aren't the only ones who can impose taxes. And in fact, if you go to the state of Pennsylvania, the liquor monopoly there is the way that the government raises revenue from taxing liquor. Monopolies are just as capable of taxing labor through reducing wages and taxing consumption by raising prices as are governments. And while government taxes have gone down by a bit, the taxes imposed by monopolies in a series of papers recently we've seen have dramatically increased over this period, far more than government taxes have fallen. And if you believe in supply-side economics, which I do, you should think that that monopoly tax will reduce growth, will reduce productivity improvements, will slow down our economy. And that is precisely what we've seen over the same period. The growth rates of the wealthy countries have fallen roughly in half in the last 20 years what they were in the 30 years following the Second World War. And in some countries, especially European countries, the fall has been even more dramatic, basically an order of magnitude reduction in medium-term growth rates. This combination of stagnation with inequality, what in the book we call stagnequality, which is a really ugly word, but it's a much uglier phenomenon, so we think it's appropriate, is increasingly discrediting the economic orthodoxy of our time, what you might call the neoliberal economic orthodoxy, in much the same way that the stagflation, the surprise of stagflation, discredited the Keynesian orthodoxy that prevailed during the 1970s. And this is coupled with an increasing discrediting of political authority as well. Because as wealthy countries have grown increasingly diverse, with increased migration, or at least different types of migration, with the accepting into the mainstream of society of ethno-racial minorities, with the entrance of women into the workforce and into more equal esteem within societies, with the acceptance of sexual minorities. All these things have made a simple one person, one vote democratic system increasingly untenable for wealthy societies because of all the way it oppresses minorities, whether those be the minorities defended by the left, like sexual minorities, ethno-racial minorities, immigrants, or those defended by the rights, like the deeply religious, the wealthy, or the gun owners. And as we've increasingly been forced to rely on courts and other extra-democratic mechanisms to resolve those conflicts, there's increasingly been a feeling of a loss of democratic legitimacy and a turn towards what you might call populism, or attempts to regain some majoritarian sense within these settings. And that's been true on the left and the right. We've seen it in Donald Trump or in the Brexit movement, but we've also seen it in Jeremy Corbyn, the Five Star Movement, many different attempts to regain this notion of democratic power. But while these populists respond to very real problems, they respond to genuine failures of the economic orthodoxy, genuine democratic deficits. They don't offer genuine solutions to these problems, in my view. They offer a return to various idealized visions of the 1950s, whether those be the state socialism that was not consistent with economic changes that occurred, or whether they be the closed societies, the suppression of different voices that was not either sustainable. What we want to offer instead is an alternative ideology, a new vision that embraces openness, that embraces diversity, that embraces technology and markets, and that turns these to actually solve the biggest problems that we're facing. So what I'm going to try to do is to start, and this will be most of the presentation, by going through the one of the proposals in more detail, which most sharply breaks apart our standard political categories and tries to force us to imagine something new. I'll then briefly run through the rest of the ideas in the book. I'll talk about the sort of social vision and movement coming out of these and conclude. Okay, so what I want to try to break apart is a standard political dichotomy that we're used to, that imagines that on the one hand, there is a vision of central planning run by a state, and on the other hand, there is private property and capitalism and, competitive markets. The great political economists of the late 19th century, like Walras and Jevons and George, saw a deep truth, which is that there's the same problem in both of these systems. Both of these systems lead to an extreme concentration of power in a small number of hands that stops the operation of a truly free and competitive market. And that only by having some form of common ownership can we hope to maintain truly decentralized and competitive exchange. So George's argument in particular was that land is not created by any person. Land was put here by God or whatever power you believe in, and therefore belongs to all people in common. And as such, all that private ownership of land can do is allow one individual or small group of people to have a monopoly that excludes that land from being used for its best purpose. And to address that problem, he proposed a tax on the value of all land that would be used to eliminate all other taxes, and that would ensure that anyone unable to use that land in a productive way would be forced to return it to the commons. This idea was enormously influential. It's sort of hard to overstate how influential this was around the world, really. Just to give you a couple tokens of this, this is a billboard that was put up on a vacant lot in New York City, and it reads, "Everybody works but the vacant lot. I paid $3,600 for this lot and will hold till I get $6,000. The profit is unearned increment made possible by the presence of this community and the enterprise of its people. I take this profit without earning it. For the remedy, read Henry George." Henry George also helped stimulate, was actually the primary impetus behind perhaps the most iconic piece of popular culture, tangible popular culture in the world. Does anyone recognize what this is? But it's not. Monopoly was but one set of rules of this, the landlord's game, invented by Elizabeth Meiji in 1905. Those are the rules you're familiar with. You could probably play this game just fine using those rules, but they were not the primary rules that Elizabeth Meiji, a follower of Henry George, intended you to play them by. She intended the monopoly rules to be a dystopia that would make you see how badly our current society operates. And instead, you might play by the rules which you can almost simulate on a normal monopoly board, where all of the land rents, though not the rents of structures you build upon them, are paid into the public treasury and are used to purchase back from their owners the railroads so that you can ride them for free, and the utilities so that you can use them for free. And then once all that's accomplished, to build free college, to be placed on Blue Blood's estate, and eventually to pay a social dividend to anyone who passes this spot, which is now known as Go. So you don't realize it, but actually every time you pay Monopoly, you are receiving a universal basic income or social dividend dreamed up by Henry George. Why is so much of that forgotten? Well, there are many bad reasons. Sun Yat-sen, who was a follower of Henry George, failed to maintain control of China until the Russian Revolution happened and so forth. But there were some real flaws in George's thinking. One is that it's awfully hard for some centralized government bureaucracy to make the distinction between what is the value of land and what is the value of the structures upon it. Another problem is that the distinction he drew between, on the one hand, land, and on the other hand, things made by people, the first requiring 100% taxation, the other requiring no taxation, is an artificial distinction. Think, for example, of a Van Gogh painting left in a dumpster somewhere before Van Gogh commits suicide, and then discovered by my friend Tommy as he walks by the dumpster one day. And he recognizes it as Van Gogh. He puts it up in his house. And he, when the Museum of Modern Art comes knocking on his door, insists on being paid $1 billion to surrender the asset. That's really no different than the monopoly problem that George was talking about. There's nothing Tommy did to deserve having stumbled across that particularly. And in fact, if you think about many of the sources of wealth in our society, you might say that they're sort of like land, except they're not literally land. Like Facebook's position in social networking, Google's position in the control over the data resources that it uses. There are many things that we might say are sort of things that were stumbled upon, but which the actual investment that is made is not so great, and that generate a rent for those people. So a brilliant University of Chicago economist, Arnold Harberger, who some of you might be familiar with the idea of the Harberger triangle, actually came up with quite an ingenious way to simultaneously address these issues of mixed private and public contributions to things and to deal with the valuation problem. And I rediscovered this with Anthony Zhang a couple of years ago. He's a graduate student at Stanford, and actually, for the economists who are in the audience, he's on the market this year and is really very brilliant. What we named the common ownership self-assessed tax. So let me read to you from Harberger's defense of this idea. So he writes, if you have to make a base for taxes, adopt criteria that determine the true economic value. The solution that the economist offers is simple and direct. Allow the owner to declare the value himself, make the values public, and oblige the owner to sell his property to any person willing to pay the declared value. The system is simple and creates incentives even beyond those existing in the market for assets to be employed in their most productive economic use. So let me try to make this a little bit more concrete. So suppose that rather than the radio spectrum being auctioned off as perpetual licenses to whoever happens to win, who can hold on to that forever and keep playing, music over the air or, whatever reruns of I Love Lucy, suppose that we had a new regime that was actually designed to facilitate the turnover of spectrum to innovative uses like Wi-Fi and 5G, which is how most of us get our communications anyways these days. Now, here is a picture of the spectrum provided by the Federal Communications Commission as transformed by an artist friend of mine, Mary Ellen Carroll. And it turns out that for many of these innovative uses, you need a rectangular chunk of this. But that's not true for over-the-air broadcasting, so you have this very fragmented spectrum. So now you want to get a big chunk of it to do 5G broadcasting. Well, what would happen in the world that I imagine? So let's say that the Q91.5 is currently broadcasting on this pink chunk of spectrum here. They assess a value of $20 million for this. And they have the right at any point in time to adjust this value as they please, maybe upwards to $30 million. But they have to pay, let's say, a 7% tax annually on the average value over time that they assessed on this. So if it was 6 months at 20 million, 6 months at 30, they would pay 7% of that, or roughly $1,750,000 in taxes, or you call them fees. But this would be true not just of this one chunk of the spectrum, it would be true of all of these little individual chunks of the spectrum. So if I were Verizon coming along, looking to buy up a chunk of the spectrum to build this service, I would see in a public space prices on all these bits. And I could circle, let's say, this chunk here that I want to buy, and pay to its current possessors the total price. And then, if this is the chunk I need, I could repackage it this way, say that's worth $1 million, but then this bit that I don't need, let's let someone else take that off me. I'll just charge $5 million for that. OK, so just to summarize those features I just illustrated, individual possessors would choose their own bundles. You would have a reasonable time to vacate a property, the same way that if you get evicted or foreclosed upon, there's a time that you have to leave. There would be a process of inspections where you could pay, let's say, 1% of the value of an asset in order to look at it to the current possessor. And then they could then decide whether they want to purchase it. The rates of the tax would differ across different assets according to two principles. First of all, assets that turn over more frequently should be taxed at a higher rate, because assets that turn over more frequently, you're more likely to sell. You have more of an incentive to quote a high price for those to try to get more money off people. The tax offsets that and leads you to want to set a lower price so that you have an incentive to be more honest. But also, there is a downside of this tax. There's a real downside, which is that it discourages investments like any tax does. And you need to trade off the benefits of the tax in terms of encouraging more fluid turnover of assets against those costs to investment. So both of those would determine tax rates for assets. This principle would apply to liabilities and mortgages as well. So you would be able to write off your mortgage against this and actually receive effectively a subsidy associated with that mortgage. So in effect, this would not just reduce the value of assets for all the taxes that would go along with them. It would effectively reduce debt. So about 2/3 of all debt would be eliminated by this. Technology would play a critical role in this process, not just in that ledger that I showed here, which you can imagine, say, something like blockchain being used for, but also in helping people to value their assets when they don't want to choose the price of everything themselves. While the rates would differ across different assets, we estimate that something like 7% is optimal for the economy overall. This would reduce the value of all assets by about 2/3, and therefore would raise about 2/3 of the return on capital annually as revenue. So what are the advantages from a standard economist perspective of implementing this? Well, there are actually many. First of all, we waste a huge amount of time engaging in bargaining that would largely be eliminated under this system. And many bargains fall through because we want to try to get the best side of that bargain. That would largely be unnecessary here. We wouldn't need to try to trick people into thinking that we value something high by pricing it high, because we would pay a tax on that higher value as well. A lot of the things like the endowment effect that we talk about, these sort of irrational attachments to objects, don't happen for things that people rent. And effectively here, in fact, sometimes you can get opposite endowment effects for things that people rent. Here, because effectively everyone's kind of a partial renter from society, many of those things would go away. People who just sort of lazily hold on to an asset and hoard it would be taxed. That's something that economists call the monopoly rent of an easy life. That would go away. And credit would be far less important in this society, because all assets would fall by 2/3. You'd be paying all these taxes. Those would be like your mortgage payments or whatever, but there would be very little down payment. So taking the fixed value of acquiring things would become far lower. And perhaps most strikingly, this would lead to a massive change in the nature of wealth. It would effectively make 2/3 of all wealth common property, and therefore would mostly eliminate wealth as a source of inequality. So let me give you an illustrative calculation for that. So median US household has about $85,000 of net assets, whereas the mean US household has almost $1 million of net assets. Under the system, the value of those assets would fall by roughly 2/3, and that would mean that to maintain their assets, a typical family would have to pay about $2,000 at market rates, but would receive about $22,500 as a social dividend. Now, that in turn means that, consider a family that really wants to hold on to their assets. They don't want to be displaced under any circumstances. They state the value of their assets at 10 times the market value. Still, they would receive $2,500 of net social dividend. So while it might seem, especially if you're a wealthy person who owns lots of things, unlike most of the people in this country, that this is a system that reduces the stability of people's lives, that's not what it does. It actually redistributes the ability to afford stability to a broader population, allowing every person to choose the amount of stability they need, but taxing the fact that hoarding things to maximize your stability reduces the ability of others to afford that stability. Overall, this would reduce inequality measured by those top percentage point, things I was talking about earlier, about half of the way to the trough that it was at during the 1970s. And while that might seem, and it is, a very ambitious, transformative, bold, Danielle would even call it ideal theory vision, it actually has many extremely concrete implications and practical applications that are already underway. The Federal Communications Commission, based on a recommendation that was made by Paul Milgram, who ran the original Spectrum auctions, is seriously considering using this for the next generation of Spectrum licenses. Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, the second largest cryptocurrency, has been strongly pushing the application of this to a wide range of digital assets, and there's dozens of startups that have already started around using this within the blockchain space. The British government is considering using this for North Sea oil drilling rights and landing slots at Heathrow. And in one of the more fanciful and fun applications, I don't know if anyone has ever seen this thing, the $1 Million homepage, where you can buy a pixel and you have sort of a collaborative homepage. Well, there's all sorts of, it's a mess, right? It's a mess because of holdout problems. What if you had a $1 million homepage based on a cost type of a system? So that's something people are trying out. It's very fun. This guy, Simon de la Rivière, is a fascinating guy and has all sorts of interesting artistic applications of these ideas. Now, those are narrower, right? But I won't just defend this in those narrower circumstances. Look, we need to experiment. We need to learn from those things. There may be deep flaws in this. But I think it has the potential, if we really extend it broadly, to actually address many of the fundamental sociological flaws that people have pointed out about capitalism. The tendency of capitalism to encourage us to have this extreme attachment to this stuff is mine and I'm going to defend it to my death. And everything else, that's someone else and who cares? Because under this system, the things around us start to become our possessions a bit as well. And the prosperity of those around us starts to become our prosperity as well, both in the dividends and in the things that we're able to access. And maybe we would invest a bit more in our communities and a bit less in ourselves under this system. And if you think about what gives people that sense of alienation, that sense that you're constantly trying to take advantage of the people around you in capitalism, it is those pricing mechanisms. It is the way in which we bargain over a used car or we bargain over a house. You think about the moments when people really feel the exploitative nature of capitalism. It tends to be in those things, not when you buy on a stock market a stock. And in this world, all those more personal transactions, they would be transformed into something that's much more just a mutually beneficial exchange. I come and I buy something. You've priced it above what you're willing to accept. I come and I take it at that price. That's that. there's no bargaining, there's no me trying to get the best of you, you trying to get the best of me. It becomes a much more true market exchange. So that's the first idea in the book. But there are 4 others that I will very briefly run through. So the second one is called Quadratic Voting, and it's a market-based system of collective decision-making that allows minorities to protect themselves rather than relying on courts to protect them. And the way that this works is every citizen is endowed with an equal budget. Oh, you can't see this. Let me see and show. With an equal budget of credits, as here, that they can spend on different issues. Say, we support a nationwide ban on the death penalty, and we support the elimination of the Affordable Care Act, let's say, and we oppose a nationwide ban on abortion. So, we're spending our credits you see our credits going down 1 unit each time, but if we want to put a lot of votes on one thing, oh, it's going down at a much faster rate there than if I just buy 1 vote on something. That prevents extremists from dominating the process, or the oppression of the minority, and allows for people to express things in proportion to how much they care. Third is the proposal that is most related to what outraged Danielle, which is the notion that every citizen would have the right to sponsor visas so that for potential foreign workers, so that rather than the businesses that employ migrants and the migrants themselves being the only beneficiaries from migration, those benefits would be spread far more broadly throughout society so that you could build support for far higher levels of migration by sharing the benefits with ordinary citizens. Fourth, we argue that antitrust policy is critical to a market economy. Just as you can't have a democracy without having, with a one-party state, you can't have a market economy with monopolies everywhere. And yet, we argue that antitrust policy hasn't really been tried. Why do we say that? We think that about 90% of the market power existing in our societies is completely ignored by current antitrust enforcement. And I'll give you 2 examples. First, labor markets have far more market power than do product markets. That is common sense for anyone who's ever worked a job. Anybody knows that, I don't even know who made this water bottle. If this water bottle went up in price a little bit, Amazon would immediately redirect me to some other water bottle to buy. I don't care. This guy has market power over me. My job? You think Microsoft dropped my wages by 10%? I'm going to go somewhere else immediately? Labor markets are far bigger sources of market power. And yet, 2 coal mines merge in West Virginia. They're a small fraction of the coal market. The Justice Department does nothing about it, even though it destroys the livelihoods of people in that area of the country. So we've completely ignored market power in labor markets, which is a far bigger issue than in product markets. Second, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, the largest institutional investors, own about 25% of the corporate economy. They're 4 of the 5 largest investors in almost every publicly traded company. And because they're totally diversified, they have no interest in seeing competition for consumers or for workers or in the political sphere, creating perhaps the most iron monopoly that's ever existed in the history of capitalism. And yet, Justice Department has done nothing about this. There's been no antitrust enforcement to deal with the power of institutional investors. Finally, we argue that the data that all of us create every day online is what trains the artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms that everyone tells us is going to displace our jobs. It's like if, when movies were invented, I went around videotaping people on the street and then said, oh, the camera is going to put all the stage actors out of a job. It's not that people are being put out of jobs. It's that you're substituting effectively tricked or slave labor for work that's compensated. And if we form what we call a data labor movement, unions, and other organizations that can collectively bargain on behalf of people for their share of the value of the digital economy. The digital economy can be a source of opportunity, and in the same time, because we're compensated for our work, we'll actually give better data that will allow better machine learning and faster impact of artificial intelligence on the economy. So these are bold ideas. All of them, we have practical near-term steps, and I can point to specific things that are going on right now on all of these ideas that are starting to explore and experiment with them. But the broader vision, we believe, can really, unlike these populist visions, really offer quantitatively the solution, a real solution to the problems that we're facing. We estimate that they would grow the economy by roughly a third, that they would, for a very long time, reduce inequality down to the levels that they were at mid-century. In the process, they would double the median income and only reduce the income of the top 1% or the effective welfare of the top 1% by about a quarter. More importantly, beyond these purely economic things, they would reconcile people who feel left behind by globalization and technology and so forth to those trends. They would actually tie their destinies to them and make them in the same way that the middle class in China are so enthusiastic about growth and development, people excited about the future. And help heal at the same time the divides between the rich and the poor world. So even though they're radical, even though they're transformed, absolutely, yes. And we need experimentation, we need learning. We actually think these have a real chance of being feasible solutions, unlike the populist answers. And I started out going around the country, and the world actually. I've done about 50 of these talks, just thinking that this was something that I would throw out there, that it would be, like capitalism and freedom did take a long time to percolate into the population and so forth. But the reaction has really been incredible. From policymakers, from entrepreneurs, from the press, from all sorts of different people, the reaction to these ideas has just been overwhelming. We started an organization to help channel all this energy about a month and a half ago, and we already have had 100 people volunteering several hours of their time a week. We have 30 people working for us more than 10 hours a week now, trying to help organize all this activity in 4 different streams: ideas and research, entrepreneurship and technology, arts and communication, and activism and government. And it's really been amazing how diverse all the work in these areas is. In fact, in ideas and research, you might think, oh, that's economics, that's mechanism design. This is Ananya Chakravarty, who runs our group on ideas and research, and she's a post-colonial historian at Georgetown. In entrepreneurship and technology, there's been several $billion of capital that have gone into startups and efforts by big companies in developing things around these ideas. And Mamie Reingold, the chair of the largest Ethereum conference, is running that track. But we also have artists doing amazing things around this. Jennifer Lynn Marone is a wonderful artist who does stuff around data slavery and who incorporated herself to try to dramatize some of these issues, who's organizing artists around these ideas. And Mark Lutter is helping organize policymakers and activists. He's the director of the Center for Innovative Government, which does charter city advocacy and stuff like this. So I hope that some of you will be inspired as well to contribute in any of these ways to this hopefully more hopeful, optimistic vision of how we can use really liberal ideas in the broadest sense of that world to solve the problems that we're currently facing. Thank you.
So we have some microphones wandering around. I'm going to go ahead and move that. So where do the mics go? So Arthur,
So thanks for an enormously stimulating talk. As you know better than anyone else in this room, almost all of mechanism design is an exercise in what Rawls calls imperfect proceduralism, right? You have an ideal, and then all your mechanism is trying to approach the idea. We know it's going to fail, right? In sorts of things you're talking about, what you're trying to deal with is, gaming the system, preference, truth revelation, things like that. And we try to be as clever as we can in designing mechanisms to approach the ideal. You haven't told us what the ideal is. And so it's left to us to say what the ideal is. And the way I'm going to approach this is to say, I have actually got a science fictional perfect procedure for you that you, if I can kind of deliver to you science fictionally, you ought to be happy with. It's called a strength of preference MRI machine. And here's what we do. Every week, we put the population into this strength of preference machine, and boom, what comes out is all the data you need about people's, I don't care what, utility, strength, of whatever you want to call it. And then you turn the crank, you got the algorithm, and then you do the perfect allocation of assets. But wait, there's more, because you actually take this ideal and you introduce it into voting, because I got something better than quadratic voting, because forget about voting. All we need to do is stick people into our strength of preference MRI, and we get the perfect democratic answer. Now, that's not democracy, and that's not liberty either. What it is some soft version of utility maximization, which of course we have to specify in some kind of way. So for us to find this as thrilling as you want us to find it, we have to buy onto some kind of ideal vision of utility maximization. If that's not your ideal, then tell us what is your ideal before you, I find this utterly fascinating, but the more you move from, oh boy, let's see how we can solve monopoly and do better asset allocation, to, oh, let's decide things like who, let's outsource who I should marry, right? It seems as if there's nothing in your quadratic voting scheme that ought to block that, nor does there seem to be anything that would block. Suppose, boy, you've got me worked up.
Could I respond?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, thank you for the question. The epilogue is all about these issues that you've just been talking about, so I'd encourage you to take a look at that. So the first thing is, I resist the philosopher's inclination to think that the right order is always to specify the ideals and then to work from there downwards. The reason I resist that is, first of all, as a pragmatic matter, Eric and I don't really agree on the deepest ideals particularly. Eric is a pretty thoroughgoing utilitarian, and I'm maybe, if you've read Yuval Harari, ultimately something a little bit more like a dataist or something like that, some notion of order and intelligence and something of that general sort. So I don't think you need to agree on that. And by the way, the book is deliberately written in a variety of justificatory tones, as is Henry George. There are utilitarian arguments for this, and we derived it methodologically using utilitarianism. But we also methodologically derived it using an assumption of independent private values, which is a more detailed economic assumption, and we don't believe that's true either. We've shown that it's robust to lots of other things, and I think you can show that it's also robust to different moral perspectives. And we've put quite a lot of work into doing that. Even more, Zoe and I, Zoe's in the audience, wrote a paper where we really try to work out a variety of different moral perspectives on this. And we did not talk about outsourcing marriage. We did not do all those things because we are not down the line absolute utilitarians. That's not our view. And you shouldn't assume that it is. So I genuinely, I think these are creative ideas. They are derived from a utilitarian calculus, but that doesn't mean that that's the only justification for them. And I'm happy to give many different justifications for them, and I do, and I will continue to, because I don't think that the fighting over ultimate justifications is the most exciting way to make progress as a society, and neither did the political economists of the 19th century. That doesn't mean they don't talk about those things. They're important, but they have to be part of a broader conversation, I believe.
So why don't you go ahead and say a little bit something about how you understand yourself to be reuniting normative political philosophy or moral theory and economics. Just go ahead and spell that out a little bit.
I mean, look, it's not just normative political theory. I know that that is near and dear to your heart and to that of the center, but it's also sociology. It's also law. Look, what I fundamentally believe, the project of this, what to me this radical project within the academy means, is that actually if we take more seriously than the people within each discipline do the things on which they are focused, we actually get close to the ideas of the other discipline. And so I'll give you an example of that from sociology. There's a theory called signaling in economics, and if you go really deep into signaling theory, it has extremely radical prescriptions for what we do. It suggests things like, for example, we should tax people who use standard white English because that's a positional thing that's a source of power. And in fact, all of these things many of the things that we usually refer to as privilege, cultural privilege, signaling theory, if you just read it and you just look at the math, it says that we should be taxing those things, which is awfully close to things that sociologists would be afraid to say but kind of believe. You know what I mean?
That says we should be taxing these. That's where you are bringing a normative view about
Well,
distribution of power, right?
Well, no, but I'm just saying if you just follow the, quote, utilitarian logic that they do, which a lot of people would dismiss, and you just say, what does it logically imply? It implies that a lot of these things that would be called privilege, we should be taxing, these cultural privileges. And that's pretty close to something that I think a lot of sociologists would sort of think, but would be afraid to say because they would say, oh, economists will think we're crazy or we'll sin too radical or whatever. So if you actually just, or the theory of public goods, this is something that Zoe and I and Danielle and Priya were talking about earlier. The theory of public goods, if you really take it seriously, everyone learns it in Econ 101, but then you kind of dismiss it and say, oh, whatever. If you really take that seriously, it implies a completely different organization of society than the organization of society we have. It's like a hugely radical thing. And I think that this is true in relationship to ethics. I think if you really take lots of things in utilitarian economics seriously, they actually connect to these communitarian liberal debates. They connect to a whole bunch of rich stuff within normative political theory, but also to sociology and to political science and so forth. So I really fundamentally believe that if we take our own results seriously and we don't dismiss them and we don't just allow conservative things to wrap them, we'll find that there's much deeper connections between these fields than we might otherwise think. And the thing that frustrates me, that philosophers sometimes do, and I can complain about economists forever, is they want to say, oh no, I don't like utilitarianism, we disagree. But I think that the problem with that is that if you actually look deep into utilitarianism, you may actually find things that resonate rather than conflict. It may actually be the superficial utilitarianism and maybe the superficial version of the other things that are in conflict with each other.
Lots I could say, but I won't do it right now.
I'm still trying to get my head around what it's like to live in Marketopia.
Yeah.
And there's two sort of things that I'm puzzled about. It's labor income and saving. And we know a large fraction of the inequality of income has to do with, nothing to do with capital, has to do with earnings. So to be very concrete, let's imagine I'm Taylor Swift, and I make $80 million a year giving.
A little hard, Greg.
I make $80 million a year giving concerts, which I think is about right.
Yeah.
And I want to save a bunch of it by buying stocks, bonds, and real estate. What is that? How am I affected by your new regime?
So first of all, on labor income, this does not do a lot to alleviate labor income inequality. It does do some, because the stuff about labor market power would have some effect on that. The stuff on data labor would have significant effect on that, but it does not do a lot to alleviate that. In terms of saving, effectively, all saving is depreciating through the wealth tax. And so that is a cost. That's the reduced investment that I was talking about. So that's a problem. I don't think if you're making $80 million a year, you're going to find that it depreciates too extremely, that you're not able to live. But yeah, you're not going to be able to accumulate wealth over long periods of time in a light and costless way within this system. And that's a loss of investment efficiency that, according to our analysis, is more than compensated for by allocative efficiency, which I think is the basic intuition behind capitalism in the first place, because feudalism is the ultimate system of stability and maintaining forever whatever you've accumulated. Capitalism, what actually made it work, was not absolute preservation of private property. It was the dynamic ability to reallocate assets. And there's wonderful stuff about in the history literature that's precisely about that. I would love to get as diverse of a set of questioners as we possibly could, because that would, I always find I get the best questions from people who might not think they're entitled to ask questions. But
That means students.
students and women.
Right now, but exactly.
Yes.
I know the folks here have thought about your book, so.
Students always give me the best questions. So yeah.
We'll come. Oh, good. You ready to go?
So I have a question about your first proposal, and this isn't normative, but I'm really interested in the system, and I'm wondering how you would extend that type of tax, or I forget what you call it, to industries where the main asset isn't fixed capital good, but rather something like money. For example, like Goldman Sachs or much of Wall Street, right, where the use of that asset can actually pose a systemic risk to the economy.
So I actually think that, and this is a really great research area that someone should work on. To a first approximation, I think finance would disappear in the world that I'm describing. Because the thing is that capital kind of goes away in this world, and like debt kind of goes away, and everything is like open and available and priced. So I don't want to say it too strongly because I haven't completely worked it out, but like I think pretty much like the blockchain becomes the financial markets or something like that in this world, or something like that. And so I think most of those industries would at least come to have a very small role within the economy.
There's more Sophia and Linnea. Either of you want to jump
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk more about the system of sort of the anonymous bidding, or not anonymous, but like the bidding in which you are forced to sell.
Yeah.
Because one, I think, effect that we don't, or one power that we all have is being able to choose who we sell to. So, for instance, if I like had a plot of forest land and some people who were oil developers wanted to come and like buy my land, maybe for moral reasons I wouldn't want to sell particularly to them. Or if I'm a vegetarian, I wouldn't want to my land I wouldn't want to take money from people who would be starting a factory farm. And I wonder if if you could talk a little bit about that, or if maybe I'm thinking about it the wrong way.
So I think what you said is correct, though I view that as a feature, not a bug, because I think a far more common narrative of people discriminating in terms of who they sell to involves urban land markets and the way in which certain groups have been historically excluded from certain areas by people making those determinations of who they do and do not want to sell to. I think, look, there have to be mechanisms for dealing with externalities and for helping people deal with those ethical issues. That's what quadratic voting is about. That can happen through a reasonably open democratic process. But I actually would much prefer a system where people have less discretion over who they sell to, over one where the people who happen to own assets, which are overwhelmingly disproportionately certain types of people, wealthy people, certain population groups that have traditionally controlled assets, are the ones who primarily get to make the decision about who owns assets within our society. You can, for every example that you have of someone for ethical reasons not selling it to family farm, given that most assets are controlled by capitalists in a capitalist society, the obvious thing that's going to be more common than that is some capitalist controlling an asset and choosing not to sell to someone who's less advantaged than they are. So on net, it's just any system that's breaking up concentrated control of capital has to have the property that on average, it's offering more opportunities to those who have less capital and taking those opportunities from those who have more. I love it, Danielle, with just a little intervention,
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. You were saying that all assets would be up for bids. Is there timing involved? Is this going to be real time or every month, every year? Because I think the frequency or how long you get to temporarily own an asset can make a huge difference about how much I'm going to invest in it in order to create value.
So that's a great point. So not everything is up for bid. That's not the system we actually propose. The system we propose is there would be a tax, and you'd have to sell at that rate, but the money would go to you. It wouldn't go to the public if someone bought it. And in terms of how often that can clear, I think in that particular system, it actually doesn't matter that much. For the bidding, it absolutely does, in the Marketopia version. But that's not really the system we're proposing. We're proposing one where you have a price, and any time someone can come along and purchase at that price, you can change that price at any time you want. And then you have to surrender the asset. And you would have some period to surrender it, so it wouldn't be immediate.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that when you talk about common ownership, there is this usual question, which is like the tragedy of the commons. And it seems that in your system, if I'm renting a particular piece of land or something, I will actually have quite an incentive to just exploit it as much as I can and just deplete it, as opposed to thinking in the long term and just making sure that it can be sustainable.
That's absolutely right. That's the converse of the point I was talking to Greg about investment efficiency. Investment efficiency is the same as running down things that you control, and that is a disadvantage. You can potentially counter that to some extent by giving people subsidies, or, for example, when you rent a property, most people who rent something don't completely trash it. They probably don't take as good care of it as when they own it. But if you had a 1/3 ownership stake in something, I don't think you'd totally trash it. And in fact, people don't totally trash companies that they have a 1/3 ownership stake. In fact, I work for Microsoft Corporation. There's probably ways I could steal from Microsoft Corporation. They give me a little bit of equity to keep me attached to it, and that helps me have somewhat aligned incentives. Same thing's true of CEOs. They have a tiny ownership stake in things. Doesn't mean that they completely trash them. So I think it's important that you have some stake in the things that you have some ability to control in order to prevent those types of problems. Having 100% stake and 100% control is not necessary to get a reasonable approximation to taking care of things.
Yes, so just as a follow-up, so I think there's a distinction between being like a co-owner of something, and therefore we together have an incentive to actually make this thing strive, as opposed to being a temporary owner. And in that case, I'm 100% owner of this thing during this time, but I know that eventually when...
But that's not what's going on here. Here, you are absolutely a co-owner. You own about 1/3, because the reason is if you invest, your price will rise. And so you will end up selling to someone, but it's not like you get none of the value after that period. You do get the value after that period because the person pays you for however valuable it is at the end of that period. So it really is very much equivalent to being like about 1/3 owner of the relevant property.
Thanks. You talked about wanting to reduce taxes on improvements on assets so as not to discourage investment. But you also talked about the line between the inherent value of an asset like land and improvements you make on it being inherently amorphous.
Yeah.
How do you solve the problem of people massively overvaluing the cost of the improvements they've made on property so as to create a monopoly and prevent other people from buying up those assets?
So anything that you bundle together would have to be taxed at the joint rate. Only things that could be separately removed could be taxed, could be priced at a higher, could be priced at taxed at a lower rate.
So there's not a solution to the discouragement to investment then?
No, that's not true. You could give people tax deductions for making investments. They don't have to self-assess those. That could be more objectively assessed the way it is in our current tax system.
I find that intriguing because it wraps around to the question of how involved the central authority is in planning then. If you're deciding what kinds of...
So obviously that brings central authorities in more, that version. Certainly less than under a current system, but more than under this system. So that would be a trade-off.
Hi. How do you think about transitioning to such an economy? If we are assuming that anybody can buy whatever they can pay for, we are starting off with a world that's extremely unequal. So there are people who have no money, also don't own any land. So do we start off with giving everyone a pot of gold?
So you start off with the most plutocratically owned assets, like spectrum, like natural resource leases, et cetera. Then you move to corporate assets, which are the next most plutocratically owned. Then you move to private corporations. and you walk down that hierarchy of assets from the least controversial and most plutocratically owned to the more controversial and more individually owned assets. And by that time, people are receiving significant dividends from those, and then I think that largely alleviates the problem.
I think this is sort of a follow-up to the question that the woman in the second row asked a moment ago. But what if your system-wide goal is not allocative efficiency or growth, but sustainability? And I mean in the sense of, preserving the planet. How does this model work?
Well, that's not a goal that is necessarily, unless valued by human beings, going to be promoted by this system. This is a highly humanistic system. That's definitely a limitation on the value that's put in here. Quadratic voting, I think, could be very useful for reaching climate change agreements and dividing up the costs of those things and so forth. So I think it can be useful for sustainability goals that are valued by humans. But if you have a fundamental view that says, no, we have to sort of do whatever it takes to stop growth or something like that, I don't think that's going to be an outgrowth of this system, because that's not the input that the system takes. So.
So I think this is really cool in that it sounds like a liberation brought about by the technocrats. But in thinking about the future of education, which perpetuates a lot of the systemic inequalities that you're seeking to resolve, my question is, when private education, let's think about Harvard, is a corporation in and of itself, what do you see as being the pedagogical leaning of your plan, and how do you solve the privatization of education?
So as with some of the more environmental issues and so forth, I don't think this speaks very directly to the issue of education. I mean, to the extent that it provides means for us to do things in a more collective manner, it might be useful in regards to education if that's provided as a collective good. But I don't think any of the ideas in the book speak very directly to that, except to say that there's quite a lot of evidence that most of the educational inequality actually doesn't happen through schools. It happens before school and outside of school. And to the extent that this gives, for example, single mothers more freedom to spend time with their children and helps develop communities that are broken by inequality in various ways, maybe we can alleviate some of those inequalities, which may be actually more important than inequalities in formal schooling, to creating that perpetuation of inequality.
You mentioned that everyone would need to disclose the price of the assets that they own.
Yeah.
And these information must therefore, of course, be publicly available for everyone to know if they can purchase it or not, which inevitably leads to a loss of privacy for everyone, because everyone will be able to know about people's wealth. Is this a consequence which you would address in this?
So for the most part, I think that's a feature, not a bug. There are some issues where it is a bug. So, for example, there are items of personal property, not private property. So I would make the distinction between private property being like large value-generating assets and personal property being things you could actually hold on your person or something like that. There are some items of personal property which we should not want to be disclosed in a public manner. I think the solution to that is honestly not really any different than the solution that we use in insurance. When you move across states, you fill out an insurance form. For the large items, you list them with a dollar value, and then you say personal property, and you put some value on all of that. So my guess is people would do that, and that would stop them from having to disclose anything other than sort of the aggregate value of their personal effects, rather than itemizing each one of them.
Yeah, okay, but what I'm referring to is that, of course, people, if, for example, in this insurance case you're mentioning, it's only between me and the insurance company that people know how much I own and how much wealth I possess.
And I understand that point, and that I'm willing to embrace. I think that's a feature. I think the notion that we would have more publicity about large wealth owned by people, that I think is a good thing.
Large wealth owned, but also very little wealth owned by some people.
I mean, so first of all, there would be much less inequality in this world. But yes, I think that I don't object to that being more public.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Time for a couple more questions. So I think Sophia was waiting, and Eric, and then we'll see where we go.
Yeah, so setting aside sort of the quadratic voting solves this answer, is there a principal place where you draw the line about what you do and don't ask people to declare and put up for sale? Because it seems like your story about the randomness of ownership or the contingencies that led you to have various forms of personal property that might be holdable in your hand applies very similarly across this. And that would require sort of deeper principled commitments on your part to draw a line.
So where I draw the line is things that I would call matching goods. So basically, by that I mean things where I think there is a strong argument that you have a general reason to care about who it is that purchases that thing rather than just that it gets sold. So an example of that would be your labor. I don't think labor should be subject to this because you care not just whether you work, but who you work for and in what environment you work. I think that's true of the author's moral rights in intellectual property. So there's a distinction in intellectual property law between the commercial rights and the moral rights. So you can sell off the commercial rights, but you can never sell off your right to veto someone using something in a way that could be defamatory towards you or misrepresent your. So exactly where we draw those lines, there's a whole legal literature on that, and I don't really have that much to add to that, but that's where I'd try to draw the line. Something that is you versus something that's owned by you is where I would try to draw the line.
He was wondering how tight-knit the connection is between the quadratic voting system and the economic reorganization. It looks like a marriage of convenience that you think that there's a greater preference sensitivity that you get as independent advantages to the voting system, but it doesn't really look that there's fundamentally a single theory driving both of them. Or maybe there is, and you could say more about how that's, or is this highly modular, and you would urge quadratic voting for us now or for any other system?
Yeah, so there's, that's got a complex set of answers because on the one hand, the book is deliberately written in a modular way, precisely to be modular. And I would advocate all 5 of these ideas independent of the others, on the one hand. On the other hand, while they seem to be different, they actually could hardly be more closely linked in terms of the theory that they're derived from. At a technical level, they're both approximations to the Vickrey mechanism. They're basically local approximations to the Vickrey mechanism. So they're literally derived from the exact same theory. And in fact, there's like a way in which they're like literally duals of each other. So that's something I don't have time to get into. And at a more like level in between, Zoe and I, in the work that we've been doing with Vitalik, have been talking quite a bit about actually how these really combine in very interesting ways. At some level, quadratic voting, if you really take it to its logical extent, requires a lot of taxation in order to fund the things that public goods would provide. And this provides a base for that taxation. And while I talked about the social dividend, that was really shorthand. I actually really don't believe in social dividends. I believe in funding of public goods. So anyway, but.
So you can see that, again, although it reads as a modular book in which people can pick up individual policy proposals, there is a much deeper ground here. And although you have not tonight fully articulated the normative commitments that shape why you're looking for the kinds of mechanisms you're looking for, they're there. So you're going to have to keep talking to Glen, I guess, in order to get the full engagement with the ideal theory element of this project. But it is indeed there. Thank you so much.